squares, I will be teaching you today how I made these granny square crochet drawstring pants. Following the same construction, you can add on an extra granny square as well. You'll first start off creating your 4 round DC stitch granny squares. For this sizing, I made a total of 30 squares. For the waistband, I started by attaching 6 granny squares in 1 row. For another pair that I made, I added on that extra granny square for a total of 7. So for this tutorial, I will be showing you how I created it with 6. Next, you'll be creating your middle strap band by laying your granny squares completely flat. You'll be working into the middle section of the band to create the pant legs. Working into the middle of the granny square by omitting 1 chain and 1 set of 3DC clusters and 1 other chain. Creating this row of middle pants band strap will create the opening once attached to the other side to create the opening for the legs. Using your yarn needle and a strand of yarn, attach the strap band to the other side of the granny square round. Now you will have 2 open leg pant openings. To create the pant legs, you will be attaching the granny squares to the middle pant band. But first, we're going to create the waistband of the drawstring in order to test out your pants. Now I will be decreasing by omitting a chain 1 for my waistband in order to cinch the waist. You can entirely add on a chain 1 if you want to maintain the sizing. This round will also be where your drawstring chain belt will go through. For the attached corners, what I like to do is I like to work 1 HDC into the first opening and then 2 HDC to complete the 3DC cluster. For my final round, I worked 1 HDC into all of the stitches all around, though you can continue creating more 3D clusters if you want to add more of the waistband to the pants. Now your drawstring will go into round 1 of creating the waistband in between the 3 HDC clusters. This is why I like to create the drawstring so that I can test out my pants as I go. And you can also stop here and have yourself a pair of granny squared shorts. Now to continue on creating the granny square pants. Each granny square stitch will align itself to the corresponding granny square stitch. Just continue adding on squares to the length that you desire.